Welcome back, everybody, to episode 12 of the Arch City Poker Podcast. My name is Tony alongside Nick. And Nick, happy January 20th. How are we doing today?
Doing great. Let's talk about some draws.
All right. Yep. Today we're going to be talking about draws. And if you didn't catch last week's podcast episode, we talked about YouTube poker, if it's considered real poker or not. Because you see a lot of things online and you may want to incorporate it into your game. And we try to help unmuddy the waters to help let everybody know what good and concise poker is and maybe perhaps what the online community is trying to do in addition to maybe playing good cards. So today we're going to be covering draws. And if you want to learn more after this podcast, go ahead and visit archcitypoker.com, where we have tons of No Limit Texas Hold'em and Pot Limit Omaha content for you to consume. You become a member, and we have what is called the Learning Management System, which is its own program that we had custom built for all of our users. It's a very great and fantastic tool designed to help you curate your own learning libraries. You get to save videos. You get to get notifications on new content that gets released. It's just a fantastic platform if you haven't already subscribed to the content. So, Nick, we're talking about draws today. And the first question, because there's a lot of questions, we could probably spend the entire 45 minutes on one specific question, but we're going to try to cover a lot. And for those listening in your own card room, we're going to help plug up some of the leaks that you may or may not have in your game. And if you ever get into a specific spot or you have a specific hand and you're unsure of how to play that draw, hopefully this podcast will provide a little bit of context, a little insight for you. So, Nick, when we're talking about playing draws, before we even cast too large of a net, we want to help highlight what types of hands we consider to be our drawing hands that we want to play. Obviously, hands like 4-8 offsuit, in theory, is a drawing hand, but those aren't the types of hands we're talking about. So, Nick, can you help kind of set the parameters of the types of drawing hands that we're oftentimes going to be playing if we adopt an Arch City poker play style?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the type of game you're in. I mean, if there are a lot of multi-way pots and if rake's a little higher, you probably want to stay more towards like the nut flush draw combos, like the ace-x suited combos. Obviously, the better the kicker, the better the hand, but the suited broadways, the pocket pairs, and then some of the suited connectors, those will play pretty well in most situations, whether it's multi-way or heads up. I mean, you would prefer to be hopefully at least 100 bigs deep or hopefully even deeper. But yeah, Tony, I think, like you said, a lot of players are playing too much of like the 2 and 3 gappers, some of like the offsuit connectors and gappers. There's a time and place for those perhaps, but it's definitely, those don't make up, a whole lot of your range. Like hopefully it's higher ranking cards, higher ranking suits and pairs. Those are where you will want to start.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know in my personal game, I traditionally probably try to keep it to one gap. It's only ever going to be wider than that if there's like a lot of like potential for me to get a lot of money. Like we're just really, really deep stacked. I have absolute position on whoever the aggressors are. There certainly are situations that make my hand range widen a little bit. But yeah, historically, you're probably looking at just one gap for the most part. You're not really going to get more wide than that. And one different thing I want to make, and you're the PLO expert, so you just correct me if I'm wrong, but we all know that drawing hands in PLO just as important, if not more important, in the types of hands in PLO than No Limit Hold'em, basically because there's more people involved in the hands, so we want more nutted draws. Is that kind of the same thing we want with No Limit Texas Hold'em? Or why does the like having the top of the draws maybe matter a little less in No Limit Hold'em?
No, I think you bring up a good point. I think if you are, especially if you're expecting multi-way action, then you definitely want to steer towards more like the nutty draws. Like I said, the ace-x suited hand, some of the better King X suited hands because a lot of the live low stakes population, the majority of them, one of the biggest mistakes that they in fact make is playing way too much suited junk. And it's a lot of like 10-5 suited, Jack 7 suited, 5-3 suited. And so, yeah, if you're expecting a lot of multi-way action, you definitely want to be on top of their draws with yours. Now, if you're at a table or playing within a population where you can get heads up more often, and with the way that we suggest that you guys play, the way that we teach you how to play, you probably will end up heads up in maybe 3 ways the majority of the time. Then it won't matter quite as much. But I think if you guys are seeing a lot of multi-way pots, you definitely want to skip the like the hands that will put you in a position to make like non-nutty draws and non-nutty made like flushes, being on the bottom end of straights. Like that's definitely something that you do have to keep in mind still in No Limit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you hit it right on the head. And as we continue to talk about draws, one of the foundations for Arch City Poker, the play style that we try to implement and teach all the individuals who subscribe, is really getting a good handle on the idea of position and absolute position. And honestly, just being aware of position. When we talk about draws and playing a draw both in position and out of position, how does position change the way in which we interact with a draw? Now, I know that's a big question, but do we approach draws differently from in position and out of position?
Yeah, a little bit. I would say in a vacuum, I mean, it kind of starts with how we suggest you guys play out of position, in position in general. If you're out of position, the vast majority of the time you're going to be checking your range. And why are we doing that again? Because the live low stakes opponents, they tend to let you know exactly where they're at based on if they bet, which they tend to bet too merged, so they tend to stab too much, and then their sizing on top of that will let you know pretty much where they're at within their range. Now, like it's not like somebody bets half pot and it doesn't mean they can't have the nuts, but it just means in general they have a little bit of a wider range. So when we're out of position, let's say like I check and I know that there's somebody that's not overly passive, so I don't need to bet into them, because if we do get a really passive opponent, then we probably should just bet into them. But if we get somebody that is willing to stab quite a bit when they're checked to, and because a lot of these players just think, oh, this player checked, so they're weak, so I'm going to bet, and whether they're betting for value, whether they're betting for thin value protection, a lot of them will bet hands like pocket eights on King 10-5 because they just want to take down the pot right now. If you have somebody that you know can do that, and they do telegraph their hand strength based on sizing, then you can play your draws accordingly. If they bet smaller and you know they're probably wider, probably in a weaker portion of their range, then you can play, honestly, all your draws as aggressively as you want, from your draws that are the most high equity combo draws that can play for stacks right then and there, or it could go all the way down to, say, your gutters, and you can start playing your gutters really aggressively. Now, let's say that same opponent or whoever in position bets pot instead of half pot. And again, the live low stakes players are really terrible about letting you know exactly where they're at in the range based on their sizings that they use. So if they bet pot, then the only draws rather that I'm going to play aggressively are the ones that don't really need any fold equity to be profitable to get it in. Because if you're deciding whether you want to play a draw aggressively or passively, you have to understand or have a good idea for how often you think your opponent's going to fold if you do play it aggressively. So if I have somebody that bets pot, it's very unlikely they're going to fold. I don't have as much fold equity, therefore I need more equity. I need a better hand. I need a really good draw, like a really nutty combo draw, right? Like straight draw plus flush draw could be something like top pair nut flush draw, although that's getting more into like good showdown value. We might get into that later in this episode, but you guys get the idea. Like you just need a really nice draw. But if you do have something like an open ender, or even just like what I would refer to in PLO as like just a dry nut flush draw, or like a naked nut flush draw where you don't have a straight draw with it. It's just a nut flush draw. Or you have the gutter. All those I would consider Like the nut flush draw I would consider like higher equity, but not the highest of equity. That's not one that can play for stacks against somebody that just pots it right away.
Hmm.
Now, if they have pot it, sure. But if you have the gutter, you have the open ender, those I would want to play. The gutter would just fold against pot. The open ender could call, especially depending on how much is left behind. And like Tony said, guys, this is something that you could get really into the weeds here. But again, in general, in a vacuum, the larger they bet, the less fold equity you have, the nicer the draw you need, the better the draw you need, the stronger the draw. If they're wider or if they're betting smaller, then you can get much and not get, you should become much more aggressive with all of your draws because aggressive poker is going to be winning poker, especially when you know your opponent's weaker. So if you're out of position, that's how we're going to play it the vast majority of times. We're going to check, we're going to find it, we're going to get a little bit more info about our opponent's range, and then we're going to go from there. If we're in position, it's kind of the opposite. We're probably betting the vast majority of our range for a little bit smaller. And if our opponent, just calls, we can determine if we're able to continue barreling with our draw. If we have showdown value or we pick up showdown value, then we might slow down. If we think there's not enough fold equity, but we have a draw that we'd like to see a river with, that's where you can maybe check back the turn. So in position is more of, you do have more flexibility as far as there are some spots where you can play them a little bit slower if you feel you're lacking that fold equity, and you can realize the equity of those draws by checking back and seeing a river. If you're out of position, again, you can play it slower based on sizing, where you determine your opponent is in the range. But yeah, Tony, I mean, it's tough to say like we play them drastically different in position and out of position. I think it's more we want to figure out as quickly as possible where our opponent is within their range, and then that will determine how we proceed with our draw, whether we raise, call, or fold.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up so many good points. One direction I want to take us, and I just want to see if it changes the way in which you maybe talk about this topic, but the board texture, obviously if we have a draw, we've connected with it to a certain extent. But you also talked about like different types of opponents might indicate that we do different things, whether they are particularly aggressive or maybe they're a little more nitty. So if we have a hand like 7-8 of diamonds, and maybe we open pre-flop, maybe we called in position because it's kind of right, it's there. You can either call or raise in most circumstances when you're in position. And we have a flop of, let's pretend, ace of diamonds, 5 of hearts, 6 of diamonds, right? So we have an open-ended straight flush draw, but we know that the ace smashed our opponent's range. So perhaps maybe check raising or maybe starting to get particularly aggressive doesn't have a lot of fold equity. What types of boards might influence the way that we approach a lot of our draws?
Well, I think it depends on, again, kind of how we range our opponent more than anything. Like in that example, like that draw is so strong that I would still recommend playing it very aggressively because, especially if you guys are deeper, like you're basically putting your opponent in a position where they have to decide that they want to play for stacks with a lot of one pairs, even if it is top pair, when you do have a hand that's basically just flipping with theirs. So like you don't really even need fold equity. You just need them to fold some of the time, and they will, like over the course of time, especially if you guys are deeper, like they will let go of top pair if there's enough money behind to get them to do that. Now, if there's not enough money left behind and it's somebody shallower, you probably shouldn't have called in the first place. But let's say that you did, because sometimes in poker, and by sometimes I mean a lot of the time, you're going to make mistakes and you just don't want them to snowball. But let's say you guys misread somebody's starting stack. Instead of, let's say it's a 1-3 game, instead of 300, they only have 200, and you call on the button with the 8-7 of diamonds. And that's a mistake. But let's say you realize it and you're like, oh shit, I made this mistake, but let's just play the hand the best we can now. And it comes ace-6-5, and all of a sudden your opponent pots it on the flop, right? So there's no fold equity there. Like, I mean, it's not bad to get that money all in probably, but there is some room when you have absolutely zero fold equity, but you have so much equity with your hand that you can call. But it's still advisable that you guys play that kind of draw incredibly aggressive. when at all possible. Now, as Tony brought up, if like if you guys believe that your opponent, for example, has a bunch of like big cards in their range and the flop comes something more middling to lighter, then that could be a spot where you do attack them a little more liberally, especially if their sizing is not so large. Um, theory would dictate that you attack more often on the boards that you're doing better on than your opponent. However, in the live low stakes games, that's not like we don't need to take it that far. I think that's a mistake. I think that's just honestly leveling ourselves. We again just need to understand how the board interacts with our opponent's range. Like how do we range our opponent? Figure out what they have, and then we're able to go from there. And that's gonna be the most important thing.
Yeah, I think just through natural conversation, I mean, this topic is basically taking us to the next question, which is how does sizing impact what we do, right? So sometimes we're the pre-flop aggressor and people lead into us out of flow, or sometimes it's on us and we're trying to make a determination as to what size are we going to bet here? Are we going to bet a third pot, half pot, over bet? We're trying to really just figure out how do we get our opponent to kind of do what we want. And I would say one of the biggest leaks that I see when people are playing draws is they're just check calling just so often. They're not particularly aggressive with it. And when they bank the card that they're trying to get, then they'll lead for a lot of money. And it's kind of easy to tell. But Nick, when we're talking about the sizing impact of what we're doing, when people maybe bet into us when we have a draw, or if we're trying to make a bet sizing based on the board texture, how are you navigating? Is maybe a kind of an easy to digest cheat sheet for somebody listening that they could like listen to this podcast and then take it into their game? How should somebody think about when they're making a bet size, how much to bet? And then when somebody's leading into them, how their draw should interact with that bet?
Sure. First, I will answer. I actually want to. I want to add on to something you said that I think is really important. As far as I would say, for the live low stakes populations, the vast majority of you guys definitely play your draws too passively, as Tony alluded to. So there's like a faction of players, a very large faction, that play the draws too passively. There's a smaller faction that actually plays them all the time too aggressively. And it's similar to when we're talking about players bluffing in live low stakes games. Players are not bluffing enough, especially in bigger spots. And then there's a smaller faction, a much smaller faction, that just over bluffs, like just bluffs way too frequently. And there's not enough in the middle. And that's kind of similar to the draws. But I would say if you guys are in doubt in a spot, you probably want to lean more towards the aggressive side of it. You don't want to be aggressive just to be aggressive, but it's likely going to be better than being too passive. Now, let's get back to the question as far as sizing in general. I would say, yeah, again, like to give you guys like kind of the cheat sheet answer, I want to range my opponent. And then I want to figure out if as we progress through the hand, like on the flop, you're generally going to have smaller sizings to begin with in position, no matter what, for the most part. Out of position, you're either check raising really large. Tony and I have talked about, like, especially recently, like, I mean, a lot of the classic check raise sizes tend to be like around 3x because players just like, that's just what players do. It's like close to like a half pot raise essentially, but they're missing out on a lot of value and a lot of fold equity by not going a lot larger, especially in the live low stakes games. And especially when stacks get deeper, like I think there's room to go between 5 and 10 to 12x. I do it all the time. I think it works really well. So when you're out of position, you're going to have these big check raises. Now, going back also, like this is kind of tying everything together in this episode, guys, that Tony mentioned before, texture. Like, how does that change things? Well, again, if it's more of a static texture, but there are like draws available, guys, you have to be mindful that your opponents can be kind of laying in the weeds a little bit more. Like their smaller sizing does not mean that they're necessarily capped, because their hands, they can't, like, in their minds, there's not as much of a chance to get sucked out on. They're not as vulnerable. So if it's more of a static board, like let's say Ace 7 4 Rainbow, and you guys have 6 5 for the open ender, I would be careful about just blindly raising if they do only bet like half pot. Like, I'm not saying you can't do it still, but it's a lot different than if it's 10-6-5 with a suit. And it's more of a much more dynamic texture. Your opponent's going to be much more face up, much more transparent with their sizing. So that's something you really need to keep in mind. Is that's like, if you go back and listen to all these episodes, they all kind of in their own way like tie together. And if you come over to archcitypoker.com, we obviously elaborate on these topics much more and much more in depth, and we go over like textures and how we can play these draws like this. But yeah, I think paying attention to texture, sizing, like I said, flop early on. If we're in position, will be smaller. If you're out of position, you're going to check call, or you're going to check raise huge. If you're the aggressor, though, and you're proceeding through the hand, especially like in position, or let's say you do bet from out of position, and it's somebody in position that's really passive, and they're not going to stab off enough, so you got to start betting yourself more often from out of position, then you probably would start like smaller some of the time. You don't need to risk as much to gain more info about your opponent's range, right, guys? So whether you're in position or out of position, moving forward, as you start to kind of naturally polarize, and especially if your opponent is just calling and they're letting you know that they're likely capped, then your sizings will increase. And so if you think your opponent's capped, then with some of your draws, especially if there's enough room left as far as stack depth, then you're going to start preparing some overbets, or you're going to be preparing in your mind like a barrel on the turn that sets up a triple on the river with your missed draw, or you might be value betting if you hit your draw on the river. One of the big things with draws, guys, is that, and I learned this way early on, that I don't remember, I want to give credit, I don't remember what, there was a little like blurb from a book that I saw that somebody wrote, and they likened playing poker, like people play poker like they play like a slot machine, and they're pumping money in, like they're trying to hit like the big score. And so like what ends up, the way it works in poker, like not gonna say like the metaphor, but like basically you guys are playing your draws and play poker in general like the slot machine, where like you are calling to hit the draw. You're not like building a pot to make sure there's enough money already in there by the time you hit your draw. Because what a lot of you guys will do is, like, let's say you have the nut flush draw, and like you might check behind in a hand, or you might check call like a really small bet. And this is where we talked about like not playing aggressively enough, and you're just kind of like playing passive to try to bink your hand to then put in a lot of money when you already are there. And that's not the proper way to do it a lot of time. You want to, like, I mean, when in doubt, like you want to put a lot of money into the pot, because then there's two ways you win the pot. You either got your opponent to fold, or you got there pretending that you had a different hand, and now you've hit your hand when all the money's already in and your opponent has basically committed themselves. So yeah, Tony, I mean, I know there's a lot with that answer there, but sizing, you're going to naturally probably be larger as you progress through the hand. But regardless, like, range your opponent accordingly. If you think they're capped, then you probably want to err on the side of larger. If you think they're not capped, though, and you still want to try to build a pot, it might be a spot where you just naturally bet smaller, or you could play the hand like with a check back, or you could plan to check call the turn. Like, if you're not wanting, if you think there's a good chance that they have kind of a nutty hand and you don't have that fold equity, or they could put in like the third bet if you put in a raise, or if you put in a barrel and you think you're going to get raised, and then you might not have the odds to continue. That's something to keep in mind as well. And you guys aren't going to know all this from just watching just this episode. Like, it's something that takes time, and you just got to get the reps in. But yeah, in general, it's, again, just range your opponent accordingly. Pay attention to their sizings, pay attention to the texture. That'll help you determine how to play your draw moving forward in the hand.
That's a lot of great information. One thing that you've always told me from back when we first started working together a decade ago was big hands should be playing for big pots, right? So your open-ended straight flush draws, should be playing for massive pots, not just waiting to bank a hand and then you're starting to pile money in. And I would say live low stakes players don't only have their one leak of just check calling too much, but they have a second leak of not sizing appropriately to get all the money in, right? Because when we're playing cards, we're trying to have bet sizes and we're trying to understand our opponent's stack size. So when we finally get to the river, the SPR is 1 or right around 1. So we still have perhaps a little bit of fold equity. We also aren't pricing our opponent into call. So if we miss all of our draws and we're barreling and maybe we bet too much and there's 250 in the middle and they have 50 behind, well, they're going to just basically do a crying call with anything that they had. And our missed draw has no fold equity. So the big leak is players not putting enough money in and waiting until they hit their draw to then start piling money in. And oftentimes when the draw comes in, it's the most obvious draw. There's 2 spades on the flop, the third spade comes in. There's 5, 6 on the flop and the 4 or the 8 comes in or something to that effect where we know that the open-ended connects. And it's going to make anybody who's even slightly a thinking player a little bit timid to then continue against large bet sizings. Versus there's no May draws yet, and perhaps they have an overpair and you just check raised their $20 bet to 120 because maybe they have 400 behind and you're trying to size it up so on the turn of the river the SPR is going to be way down. And lastly, and Nick, again, please jump in, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're being more aggressive with your draw, it is also concealing your draw more. It's concealing the strength of your hand more. So you're not going to get to a point where perhaps your villain has accurately figured out what your hand is and then decided to interact with it. They're like, well, I can't fold an ace queen on an ace high board against this person's check raise because they're just doing this so often. Or perhaps the type of villain that we're just being aggressive with our draws and our opponent is just getting a little uncomfortable with those ace high hands. So yeah, Nick, I would say, I mean, you said so many wonderful things. I would just say that the cheat sheet that you gave, smaller sizings with our draws, a lot of check raising from out of position, that's bread and butter strategy stuff. It is fantastic. And not just like those super nutty draws, but those gut shot straight draws, those maybe middling flush draws that are maybe a little more well hidden or concealed. I think there's a lot of opportunity to have some fold equity in those. And then Nick, it's going to actually take us right to our next one, which is how should we think about reacting when our draw comes in, and how do we interact with the board like when the draw that comes in is an obvious draw? Like there's 3 to a straight and then the 4, like there's 6, 7, 8, and then a 9 comes in. We're like, hey, we have a 10. But our opponent obviously can also see that our hand isn't particularly concealed. How should we kind of react when our draw comes in? Do we slow down? Do we push the pedal to the floor? What kind of things do we start to do?
Yeah, in general, definitely continue with the aggression. You build the pot to when you win a bigger pot or win stacks. So not all draws are created equally though. Like if the flush completing card comes in on the turn, we think it's a good idea to actually go smaller a lot of the time. Like if it's a really dynamic turn, like it makes a lot of sense to go smaller because what ends up happening is if your opponent has something really good, they're going to raise and let you know about it. So when you go smaller with, say, like a pretty good value hand, you're able to get away from your hand pretty easily as an exploit. If you have top of range, then you know your opponent also is higher up in their range, and so then you can end up playing for stacks after that. If they just call, then you know that they very likely don't have a flush. And so, and it could be, like I said, like either, as long as it's like a really dynamic card and they just call, then you can set up smaller value bets on the river, bigger sized bluffs on the river if you don't get there. If it's not as visible of like a dynamic shifting card, like when the straight draws come in as opposed to the flush draws, I think those are ones that I'm not saying you can't go small in those spots, but I still would definitely try to go for a very large value because a lot of times the straight completing turns will bring in like two pairs for your opponents or pair plus draw. Hands that are inelastic, like hands that they just aren't going to fold for any sizing. So, when in doubt, you're not, like I said, you're not going to play these spots all perfectly, guys. But if you were betting with a draw and then you get there, I would say definitely continue unless you have like an incredibly obvious reason not to, or you think your opponent's a maniac. Like if you're out of position, you bet the scare card, quote, scare card comes in or the draw comes in. If you think your opponent is like a barrel monkey or a maniac and they're going to bet it, then sure, like we can give them rope to allow them to bluff at that kind of card. But in general, live low stakes players are going to err on the side of like loose passive. And so we should just absolutely consider or absolutely continue putting the pedal to the floor, as Tony alluded to.
Yeah, that's an excellent one. I think to kind of have a question, part B to this, because I think a lot of players also kind of get stunted on this, but what happens when you have a drawing hand and then you flop the nuts? Like you have 6-8 and you flop a straight. You have an ace high, ace five suited that, maybe you 3-bet, maybe you 4-bet, and then you flop to flush. And you're like, oh, okay, I wanted to hit, but I'm not sure I wanted to hit that hard, right? Because
Right.
so how do you interact with the board when you hit it maybe too well?
Yeah, I would say what I would suggest to you guys, and again, like we starting out, it makes sense that you guys don't adopt like a mix strategy because I tend to kind of mix what I do in those spots depending on what kind of hand I have. But in general, like let's say we're talking about top of range hands. Like if I flop a straight, if I flop like a flush, I'm looking to pile in as much money as early as I can as possible. And so those boards tend to be more static in nature. Now, if I flop a straight, let's say I have 8-6 on 9-7-5, and there is a suit, that is more of a dynamic texture. So, I could start with a check out of position, or I could start with like a smallish at in position. But if there's no suit, it's 9-7-5 rainbow, or if I flop nut flush, and it's definitely not as connected of a board, and it doesn't even have to be with that one. That's like it's a very wet but very static board, guys. Like whatever the nuts currently are on these types of boards, they tend to remain the nuts on future streets. That's what static means. I just tend to size way up, like pot or more. Like if we're deeper, I'll overbet. And yeah, you're going to fold out. Like your opponents are going to come in with really wide ranges in the live low stakes games. They're going to fold a lot. Like it's going to feel like you're missing on this value, guys. But the hands that are like the middle third to bottom third of the range, we kind of have discussed this before in previous episodes, guys, where we kind of like split ranges into three buckets. It's kind of like your top third, which have your hands that can play for everything, or they're just like very good value hands. You have some stuff towards the bottom of that top third that could be showdown value, but then the middle bucket tends to be like more showdown value, middling equity. Like this is a draws episode, so it'd be more of your middling draws. And then the lowest bucket would be obviously like bluff candidates, air. You would have your lowest equity draws, like your gutters, pretty much like your gutters, and maybe like it could be like overcards with like a backdoor or something like that. But the biggest thing is, I would say that if you guys are in doubt on the static boards on the flop, just size way up if you flopped it, because you're basically now targeting your opponent's top of range and they're not going to fold. Like you want to get as much money in before there are any rarer dynamic or nut shifting cards like 4 to a straight that comes on that 3 straight board, or like the flush comes in on that 3 straight board, or on the diamond board the board pair comes in that kind of makes your opponent with the third nut flush want to slow down. Like you want to put in as much money as you can as early as possible so that you build up the pot so you can cooler them either turn and or river, essentially. So that's what I would suggest, Tony. I mean, for you guys that I will throw you guys a bone. If you're a little more advanced and you're watching this and you think you can handle a little bit of a mixed strategy. So like if let's say if I have ace five of diamonds and it comes king 6-4, all diamonds on the flop. I honestly, in the live low stakes games, I would take like my nut flush or my nutty flushes. I would bet them huge. But let's say I did have a hand like black king queen, and I wanted to value bet it, but I don't want to like bet huge because that's only targeting top of range. Like I don't want to just have like these high equity hands continue. Then I might personally bet really small in that spot, and it keeps the parts of their range involved that I'm okay. I'm doing okay against those. Or if I'm bluffing, maybe I have like some cheaper bluffs. I get a little bit more info out of my opponent's range. Then I decide to start bluffing heavier later. But I don't need to balance like betting really large with my value hand. That's like, well, I better make sure I show up with an overbet bluff in the spot. And I don't need to do that, guys. Like if I'm playing against Tony, like I might have to do that. But like you guys aren't going to run into those guys often enough. That's the whole point of playing max exploitative poker, playing the kind of style of poker that we're teaching you over at archcitypoker.com, is that there is no balance. We're not doing that. We're just figuring out where our opponent's at and what they do on average as a population. And then we are doing things to exploit them and to counter them. So yeah, bottom line, Tony, if I flop anything huge on especially these static boards, I'm just betting as large as I think I can get away with as early as possible to start building that pot.
Yeah. I I mean, you're again. I don't even think I have anything to add because I think everything that you said would have been something that I would have articulated. I want to kind of jump a little bit backwards, and we don't have enough time for one of the bigger questions I wanted to ask. But what we are going to ask or go over is when we are a pre-flop regressor, and let's pretend we're in position, but our opponent leads into us. Now, we don't like to preach mathematics or like what are the pot odds that we need to make a specific call. But
Right.
when our opponents lead into us out of flow and they bet a quarter pot, half pot, they bet pot, how should our draws react to that? Generally speaking.
Yeah, kind of similar to what we mentioned before, where like sizing may dictate what I do in the spot. If I get somebody that leads into me, donk bets, it kind of depends. Like a lot of times it tends to be a lot of like good but vulnerable hands. So it tends to be, in my experience, a lot of like top pair or like a lot of middling pocket pairs that just don't want to face a bet. They kind of want to set their price. It's rarely draws. So that's something to keep in mind as far as this episode is concerned. But let's say we do have a draw. If I'm facing a smaller lead, but it's more of a static texture, I will pretty much like float with 100% of what I have. And then I'll get a better picture or a better understanding of what my opponent has on the turn, because even if they're playing a little coy or maybe they're playing balanced, so to speak. I know we try to avoid that word, Tony, but like let's say they are playing with some semblance of balance in the flop, and maybe it's on accident. Maybe they're just programmed to just bet half pot when they bet on the flop. Yeah, if I think there's any chance that they can still maybe have like top of range hands, then I'll just float and I'll see what they do on turn. And they're going to be way more transparent with their sizing as they progress through the hand. So even if I have like the nuttiest of draw or I have a gutter and I just want to float, like I'll just call in those spots and then I'll see what they do on the turn, and then I can make a better, more like efficient decision with my line and or sizing. Now, again, speaking in generalities, if they don't go half pot and let's say they bet pot or they bet larger, and that's very rare when that happens, but let's say they just bet pot, well, then it's very likely that they have a hand that they really like that's as high up in their range as they probably can be. Now, it still could be a good but vulnerable hand. You don't see these guys tend to like lead with sets because they don't want you to necessarily fold. That's why I say it tends to be like a lot of top pair. Could be an overpair from like the nitty guys that don't 3-bet and now they're just betting out with like their queens on like 10, 7, 4 or whatever. But yeah, the larger the sizing, likely the less fold equity we have. So the more equity we need with our draw to play aggressively. So like if somebody leads into me for pot, if I feel I have a hand that, again, Tony mentioned, if you have a big hand that wants to play a big pot, it would have to be a really nice combo draw, like the most highest of equity draws we could have. And then everything else probably just wants to call and play a pot in position. But if we do face a smaller sizing or we believe our opponent is weak, we've seen him lead and we know he can have like pocket pairs and stuff, then yeah, we can start firing away. We can start raising with really all of our draws. So yeah, just pay attention to sizing. try to get a good feel for where your opponent is in the range, though. Like I said, guys, if you think they could be top of range, then I would lean towards more calling if you have the equity with the draw, and see a card in position. Play poker in position. Don't be afraid to see turns and rivers, because these guys will be afraid to see turns and rivers. That's why they're leading into you in the first place. They want to take down the pot right there. So I like to put them in really uncomfortable spots by just calling. They're going to let me know exactly where they're at on the turn. If they check, we often can just blindly bet. If they bet again, but they bet something that's not larger, then that's when you put in the raise and you have a lot of fold equity there. So that's how I would generally play that spot, Tony.
Yeah, I would say my experience has been relatively the same. It'll be some, and again, we're talking about live low stakes, so it's not as if these players are playing perfect poker, but it'll be something to the effect of somebody limped in, I made it 20, 25 on the button, and they called. Let's pretend they have pocket tens. And they just limped called with pocket tens, and then now tens aren't overpaired to the board, and I flop to draw. Then that's when I oftentimes see them leading into me. And I would say for anybody who's maybe experienced that kind of thing, it's pretty obvious and transparent. And just like what Nick said, but the more static the board is, the less fold equity I have found myself to have. So in a lot of cases, because they size up, I can exploitively just fold my hand. And the more nutty my draw, the more outs I have, the deeper stacked we are, the more likelihood I am to continue. But I do prefer an aggressive route versus just letting them kind of dictate the way the hand's going to play out. If I can at all understand kind of where they are in their hand range, then I like to exploit that. I don't just identify it and then accept whatever action they take. I say, okay, well, they do this with a middling pair. They do this with a pocket pair. And they're not balanced enough to where they're also doing it with draws. They're also doing it with king, queen offsuit. It's pretty obvious. And again, we're talking live low stakes populations. So there's not a ton of creativity and you can be observant at your table, and they'll be doing it against other people as well, not just against you. So if you're paying attention, by the time it happens to you, you should have some idea of kind of what it means and then be able to react appropriately. But Nick, kind of final thoughts here. And I just want to leave you with like one parting final thought and then just kind of one real quick question. But my last one is, of all the live low stakes players you've seen, what is the biggest leak that you see players have when it comes to draws, and how can they fix that?
Yeah, in general, just not playing them aggressively enough. Just understanding that it's not about trying to hit it and then get the money in. You generally want to try to make it to where you have two ways to win the pot, and you take advantage of that fold equity that you likely have, and play it more aggressively, build the pot to where you can steal it with a profitable bluff, or when you do hit your hand, then obviously you can win a nice pot off of your opponent when they have obviously something lower in their range or something lesser than your hand, so to speak. But yeah, in general, you guys are just too passive. You got to get more. You got to find spots to be more aggressive with your draws. Just range your opponent accordingly and get more aggressive. And like Tony said, it gives you more deception to your game. Like it makes it to where you get more action on your value combos. So yeah, just become more aggressive when you're in doubt.
Awesome. And last but not least, go on and head on over to archcitypoker.com, where we have all your poker needs, where we help you be a better player. If you're brand new to this YouTube video, go ahead, like, share, and subscribe so you can continue to receive all the Arch City Poker content that we have for you. And again, thank you everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Have a fantastic rest of your day.